The crash cart was already there when the patient's heart stopped. That's what kept me up for months afterward. Not the death, not the screaming, but the fact that someone had wheeled that crash cart outside room 412 a full 6 minutes before the code blue was ever called. Someone knew. Someone always knew. And by the time I figured out why no one ever survived the fourth floor night shift, I'd already become part of the problem. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to my first night at Mercy General Hospital. October 14th. The night everything I thought I knew about medicine, about trust, about the people we put our lives in the hands of, all of it shattered. Mercy General wasn't supposed to be a stepping stone. For me, it was the destination. 17 years of nursing, the last 8 in critical care at Chicago Presbyterian, and I'd finally landed the position I'd been working toward my entire career. Night shift charge nurse, 4th floor, post-surgical recovery unit. My name is Elena Vasquez, 41 years old, divorced. One daughter in college, studying biochemistry because apparently the hospital wasn't going to escape the Vasquez family anytime soon. I'd seen things in my years of nursing that would turn most people's stomachs. Watched patients come back from the edge of death, held hands with those who didn't make it, been screamed at by families who needed someone to blame. I thought I'd seen it all. The 4th floor at Mercy General had a reputation. Every hospital has that floor, that unit, that wing where the old-timers speak in hushed tones and the new grads trade ghost stories in the break room. At Mercy, it was 4 East. The post-surgical recovery unit, where complex cases went after major operations. The mortality rate was elevated. That's how the hospital administrator, a thin man named Howard Gaines, with glasses that made his eyes look too large for his face, had described it during my interview. Elevated. These are our most critical patients, he'd explained, fingers steepled like he was praying. Major cardiac procedures, complex tumour resections, high-risk transplants. We lose some. It's the nature of the work. I'd nodded. I understood. Some units just have higher acuity. It made sense. What didn't make sense was why he'd offered me a salary 15% above market rate. Or why, when I'd asked about my predecessor, he'd changed the subject so quickly I almost got whiplash. But I needed this job, and more than that, I wanted it. So I signed the contract and showed up for my first shift on a cold October evening, ready to prove I belonged there. The night shift team was small. That's normal for post-surgical. Most patients are sleeping, recovering. The drama happens during the day, when doctors make rounds and procedures are scheduled. At night, it's monitoring, medication schedules, catching problems before they become crises. There were 5 of us that first night. Marcus, Webb, a nurse with 23 years of experience, and the kind of weathered calm that only comes from seeing everything twice. He barely looked up when I introduced myself. Destiny Okafor, fresh out of nursing school, 6 months into her first job, all nervous energy and double-checking every medication 3 times. I liked her immediately. There was also James Chen, the floor's respiratory therapist, a quiet man in his 50s who moved through the unit like a ghost, appearing exactly when needed and vanishing just as quickly. And finally, Dr. Peter Hoffman, the night attending. He was supposed to be our safety net, the physician on call if anything went wrong. I would learn very quickly that Dr. Hoffman was many things. A safety net was not one of them. My first 3 hours were quiet. Too quiet. I did rounds, checked vitals, reviewed charts. 12 patients on the floor, all stable. Blood pressures where they should be, incision sites clean, pain managed. But something felt off. It was in the way Marcus watched me, in the way Destiny seemed to hold her breath every time we walked past room 412, in the way the floor felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. At 11:47 p.m, I found out what. Code blue, 4 East. Code blue, 4 East. The overhead announcement shattered the silence. I was moving before the second repetition ended, training taking over, feet carrying me toward the cluster of activity outside room 408. Marcus was already there. So was Destiny, her face pale, hands trembling as she prepared the defibrillator. The patient was a 67-year-old man named Harold Brennan. Quadruple bypass 3 days ago, had been recovering beautifully. Now he was dying. I pushed into the room and took over compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted silently, feeling ribs flex beneath my palms, watching the monitor for any sign of cardiac activity. Nothing. 1 of epi, I called out. Destiny handed me the syringe. I pushed it into the IV line. Still nothing. Charge to 200, I ordered. The defibrillator whined as it powered up. Clear! Harold Brennan's body jerked. The monitor showed a brief spike of electrical activity, then flatline again. We worked on him for 47 minutes. I called for everything in my arsenal: epinephrine, atropine, bicarbonate. We shocked him 8 times. I did compressions until my arms burned, then switched with Marcus, then switched back again. At 12:34 a.m., Dr. Hoffman finally appeared in the doorway. He watched for approximately 90 seconds, checked his watch, and said the words no one wants to hear. Time of death, 12:35 a.m. He was gone before Harold Brennan's body had even begun to cool. I stayed with the body while the others filtered out. Standard protocol. Someone has to do the post-mortem care, clean up, prepare for the family. But that's not why I stayed. I stayed because something was wrong. Harold Brennan's chart said his last vitals check was at 11:15 p.m. Everything normal. Blood pressure 128/76. Heart rate 72. Oxygen saturation 97%. 32 minutes later, he was in full cardiac arrest. Healthy patients don't just stop. Not like that. Not that fast. There's always a warning, a dip in blood pressure, a change in rhythm, something. I pulled up his medication record on the bedside computer, and that's when I saw it. At 11:20 p.m., 5 minutes after his vitals check, someone had administered 10 milligrams of potassium chloride. IV push, 10 milligrams. For those who don't work in medicine, let me explain. Potassium chloride is a common medication. We give it all the time to patients whose levels are low, but we give it diluted, slowly, over hours. Because concentrated potassium chloride pushed directly into a vein, it stops the heart. Immediately. And there's no test that will show it was given, because potassium is already in our blood. It's supposed to be there. When we die, our cells break down and release even more of it. It's the perfect murder weapon. I stared at that screen for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing through possibilities, explanations, anything that would make this make sense. A typo, a system glitch, a training exercise accidentally logged. But the medication had been checked out of the Pyxis machine, the automated dispensing cabinet that logs every drug, every dose, every nurse who accesses it. According to the record, the potassium had been checked out by Marcus Webb. I didn't sleep that day. I should have. Night shift nurses know that sleep is sacred, that the 12-hour stretches will destroy you if you don't protect your off hours. But I couldn't close my eyes without seeing Harold Brennan's face, without hearing the flatline, without thinking about that medication record. I told myself I was wrong. I had to be wrong. Marcus Webb had been a nurse for 23 years. He'd worked at Mercy General for the last 15. He had commendations, thank you cards from families, a reputation as one of the most reliable nurses on staff. He couldn't be a murderer. But that night, when I came back for my second shift, I started watching. Really watching. The 4th floor had 16 beds. That night, 11 were occupied. I made it my business to know every single patient, their diagnoses, their medications, their surgical histories. I read charts like they were novels, looking for patterns, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. And what I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 18 months, the fourth floor had lost 37 patients. That's not unusual for a post-surgical unit handling complex cases. What was unusual was the timing. 31 of those deaths occurred between midnight and 4 a.m., when Marcus Webb was working. Now, before I tell you what I found next, if you're the kind of person who's still here 15 minutes into a story about murder in a hospital, then you're my kind of person. I put out stories like this every single day, and they only get darker from here. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss what comes next. Because trust me, this rabbit hole goes deeper than I ever imagined. So there I was, second night, acting like everything was normal, while my brain screamed that I was working alongside a killer. And then we got a new admission. Her name was Margaret Chen, 72 years old, no relation to James, our respiratory therapist, though she made the joke herself when she arrived. Another Chen, she'd laughed weakly from her gurney. We're everywhere. Margaret had just come out of a 7-hour surgery to remove a tumour from her pancreas. The operation had gone well. Dr. Katri, one of the hospital's best oncological surgeons, had gotten clean margins. The cancer was contained. With chemotherapy, Margaret had an excellent chance at several more years with her family. She had 4 grandchildren. She told me their names while I checked her IV lines. Michael, Sarah, twins named David and Daniel. They're coming tomorrow, she said, eyes already heavy with post-surgical fatigue. All of them. First time the whole family's been together since Christmas. I squeezed her hand. Then you better get some rest. You'll need your energy for that crowd. She smiled at me, trusted me, and I silently swore that she would see those grandchildren, whatever it took. I watched Marcus like a hawk that night. Every medication he touched, every room he entered, every interaction with the Pyxis machine. At 1:15 a.m., he checked out potassium chloride. My heart stopped. But I forced myself to stay calm, to follow protocol, to watch. He walked to room 406, a patient named Gerald Morrison, 61, recovering from cardiac valve replacement. I followed at a distance, pretending to check on the patient across the hall. Through the window, I watched Marcus prepare a syringe. My hand found my phone in my pocket. I was ready to call security, to scream, to do whatever I had to do. But then I saw him attach the syringe to an IV bag. He hung the bag. Diluted. Proper protocol for a patient with low potassium levels. I checked Gerald Morrison's chart later. His potassium had been 2.9, dangerously low. Marcus had followed the correct procedure, administering a slow drip that would bring the levels up safely over several hours. I'd been wrong. Or had I? The third night, nothing happened. Fourth night, nothing. Fifth night, we had a code blue, but it was a genuine emergency, an allergic reaction to a medication that had been properly prescribed and administered. The patient survived. I started to doubt myself. Maybe Harold Brennan's death had been a freak occurrence. Maybe the medication log was glitched. Maybe I was seeing patterns where there were none. And then I met Thomas Young. Thomas was 44 years old, a father of 3, a high school baseball coach who'd collapsed during practice and been rushed to Mercy General with a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Emergency surgery had saved his life, barely, and now he was in room 412. Room 412. The room Destiny couldn't walk past without holding her breath. I pulled up the room's history that night while the floor was quiet and my patients were stable. What I found made me sick. In the past 18 months, 9 patients had died in room 412. 9. Every single one between midnight and 4 a.m. Every single one during Marcus Webb's shifts. And every single one had been classified as expected deaths. Complications from surgery, the natural course of serious illness. Nothing to investigate, nothing to question, just another sad entry in the hospital's mortality records. I should have gone to administration. I should have called the police. I should have done. Something official, something by the book, something that would have protected me from what came next. But I thought about Howard Gaines, our administrator, with his 2 big glasses and his 15% above market rate salary offer, and his quick subject changes. I thought about how long Marcus had worked here, how many shifts, how many patients, and how no one had ever noticed. Someone had to have noticed. Unless they didn't want to. On my 7th night, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to catch Marcus in the act. Looking back, I understand how stupid that was, how dangerous. If I was right about him, I was putting myself in a room with a serial killer. If I was wrong, I was about to destroy an innocent man's career and possibly my own. But I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Chen's grandchildren, about Thomas Young's baseball team, about all the families who'd been told their loved ones had died of natural causes, who'd grieved and moved on, never knowing the truth. I started staying close to room 412, checking on Thomas Young every 15 minutes instead of every hour, finding reasons to walk past his door, keeping the charge nurse station positioned so I could see down the hallway. Thomas was doing well. His vitals were stable, his incision was healing, his spirits were high. His wife Amy came every day from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m, and their 3 kids came after school, filling the room with stories about baseball games and homework and the family dog who'd learned a new trick. On my 9th night, Amy pulled me aside. "The doctor says he might be able to come home next week," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I didn't think I'd ever hear those words. After the surgery, when they told us it was 50-50, she couldn't finish. I held her while she cried, this stranger who'd trusted us with her husband's life. "He's going to be okay," I told her. "I promise." It was a promise I intended to keep. That night, Thomas Young's condition began to deteriorate. It started small, a slight increase in heart rate, a minor drop in blood pressure. The kind of changes that could mean anything or nothing. I paged Dr. Hoffman. Twice. He didn't respond. At 1:30 a.m, I paged him again. This time, he called back, irritation clear in his voice. "What is it now, Vasquez?" I explained the changes, the subtle warning signs, my concern that something was wrong. "Run the standard labs," he said. "Call me if his pressure drops below 90 systolic." He hung up before I could argue. I ran the labs. I ran every test I could think of, looking for an explanation, looking for something I could point to and say, this is the problem, this is what we need to fix. Everything came back normal. But Thomas kept getting worse. At 2:15 a.m, his blood pressure hit 88/52. I paged Dr. Hoffman again. No response. At 2:30 a.m, it dropped to 82/48. His heart rate was climbing. His oxygen saturation was falling. And Marcus Webb volunteered to sit with him. "You're overwhelmed," he said, and his voice was so calm, so reasonable. "Let me monitor him while you handle the other patients." I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for something in his eyes, some sign of malice, some hint of the monster I'd convinced myself he was. All I saw was a tired nurse offering to help a struggling colleague. "No," I said. "I'll stay with him." Something flickered across his face, too fast to identify. Then he nodded and walked away. At 2:47 a.m., Thomas Young's heart stopped. The crash cart was already outside his door. I didn't have time to wonder how it got there. I was too busy trying to save his life. Compressions, epinephrine, shock at 200 joules, again at 300, again at 360. Nothing. I don't know how long we worked on him. It felt like hours. It might have been minutes. Time loses all meaning when you're fighting death with your bare hands. At some point, Dr. Hoffman appeared. He watched from the doorway, just like before, just like Harold Brennan. "Call it," he said eventually. "He's gone." I ignored him. Another round of compressions, another dose of epinephrine. "Vasquez, he's gone. You need to stop." I looked up at him, at his tired eyes, his casual indifference, and something inside me snapped. "Get out," I said. "Excuse me?" "Get out." He left. They all left. Everyone except Destiny, who stayed in the corner, tears streaming down her face, watching me continue compressions on a man who was already dead. I don't know why I kept going. Maybe I thought I could will him back to life. Maybe I couldn't face telling Amy that I'd broken my promise. Maybe I just couldn't accept that it had happened again. In room 412, on my shift, with Marcus Webb working the floor. At 3:24 a.m., I finally stopped. Thomas Young was dead. I stood there, hands aching, covered in sweat, staring at his still face. And then I did something I'd never done in 17 years of nursing. I checked the medication log before anyone else could touch it. There it was, 2:41 a.m. Potassium chloride, 10 milligrams, 1V push. 6 minutes before his heart stopped. Checked out by Marcus Webb. My vision went red. I turned toward the door, ready to find him, to confront him, to scream the truth to everyone who would listen. But Marcus was already there, standing in the doorway, watching me. "You figured it out," he said. It wasn't a question. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. "I wondered how long it would take you." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The others never noticed, or didn't want to. "Why?" The word came out as a whisper, a desperate plea for something that would make sense. Marcus looked at Thomas Young's body. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "Do you know how many patients die in hospitals every year? Preventable deaths, mistakes, negligence, exhaustion, understaffing. The system is broken, Elena. It's been broken for decades. And no one fixes it because no one sees the cost. You're killing people to prove a point." "I'm documenting failures." His eyes met mine. Every patient I've chosen was already dying. Not from my hand, from theirs. The surgeon who missed a bleeder. The attending who ignored warning signs. The hospital that cut corners on staffing. I just accelerated the inevitable, made it visible. Harold Brennan was recovering. Thomas was going to go home next week. Something dark passed through Marcus's expression. Harold's surgeon nicked an artery during his bypass. Small, slow. He would have bled out internally within 72 hours. I saw it in the imaging that no one bothered to review. And Thomas, he paused. Thomas's surgeon left a sponge inside him. It was already causing infection. Sepsis was inevitable. Another week, maybe 2, and he would have been back in surgery. By then, the damage would have been irreversible. "You don't know that." "I've been doing this for 15 years, Elena. I know exactly what I'm doing." 15 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. 15 years of deaths. 15 years of families mourning natural causes. 15 years of medical errors covered up by a nurse who thought he was playing God. Why are you telling me this? Marcus smiled. It was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. Because you're the first person who cared enough to notice. And because I'm tired. He reached into his scrub pocket and pulled out a syringe. The cap was already off. I logged this one under your name, he said. Accessed the Pyxis with your credentials while you were doing compressions. If you report me, the evidence points to you. If you don't, he gestured toward the syringe. I choose when it ends, just like they did. I don't remember the next few seconds clearly. I remember lunging for the call button. I remember Marcus catching my wrist. I remember the needle pressing against my arm, cold and sharp. And I remember Destiny, sweet, nervous, by-the-book Destiny, who had been standing in the corner this entire time, who had heard everything. I called security 4 minutes ago, she said, her voice shaking but clear, and I've been recording since you walked in. Marcus froze. The door burst open. Security guards, Dr. Hoffman, other nurses from the floor. The hallway filled with chaos, with shouting, with hands pulling Marcus away from me. The syringe clattered to the floor. It was over. The investigation took months. That's how these things work. When a hospital discovers it's been home to a serial killer for 15 years, there are lawyers and administrators and PR people and police detectives all trying to figure out how it happened and who to blame. Marcus Webb was charged with 43 counts of murder. They found them all, eventually. Every patient he'd helped along, every family he'd robbed of closure. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was everything else they found. The surgeons who'd made preventable mistakes, the attending physicians who'd ignored warning signs, the administrators who'd known something was wrong and chosen to look the other way because the deaths were expected and the liability was manageable. Howard Gaines? He'd noticed the pattern years ago. He'd quietly transferred problematic nurses away from the 4th floor, given Marcus the night shifts where no one was watching, kept the mortality rates just low enough to avoid regulatory attention. He said he didn't know for sure. He said he thought Marcus was just bad luck. He said a lot of things that didn't matter to the families of the dead. Dr. Hoffman lost his license. Not for ignoring my pages that night, not for watching patients die without intervening. For years of rubber-stamping death certificates, of accepting natural causes without investigation, of being too tired or too indifferent to ask questions. The culture of silence, the lawyers called it. The system that let a monster hide in plain sight. I testified at Marcus's trial. I sat in that witness box and told the jury everything. From Harold Brennan to Thomas Young. From the medication logs to that final confrontation in room 412. When the prosecutor asked me what I thought Marcus's motive was, I told them the truth. He thought he was the only one paying attention, the only one who saw the failures. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that made it his responsibility to punish them. I paused. The scary part is, he wasn't entirely wrong about the failures, just about what to do with that knowledge. Marcus Webb was convicted on all 43 counts. He died in prison 4 years later. Heart attack. Natural causes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I still work at Mercy General. Different floor now, day shift. The 4th floor was closed for 6 months, then renovated, then reopened with new protocols, new oversight, new everything. They named it the Chen Brennan Wing, after Margaret, who survived and is still going to her grandchildren's soccer games, and after Harold, who didn't. Destiny runs it now. She finished her training, got her certifications, became exactly the kind of nurse I always knew she could be. The one who speaks up. The one who questions. The one who refuses to accept that's just how it is. Sometimes, late at night, she texts me. A question about a medication, a concern about a patient, an instinct that something feels wrong. I always answer, because that's how we stop the next Marcus Webb. Not with cameras or oversight or administrative protocols, but with nurses who trust their gut, who speak up when something's off, who refuse to let the system convince them that silence is easier. The night shift at Mercy General is still quiet. It always will be. That's the nature of post-surgical recovery, of healing bodies and exhausted families, and the long hours between midnight and dawn when anything can happen. But now, when something does happen, someone notices. Someone always notices. And that makes all the difference. I think about Marcus sometimes, about what he said that night in room 412, about the system being broken, about preventable deaths, about no one seeing the cost. He wasn't wrong about the problems. He was catastrophically, tragically wrong about the solution. The answer to a broken system isn't to become a monster within it. It's to be the person who refuses to look away, who asks the uncomfortable questions, who trusts their instincts even when everyone around them says everything is fine. That's the lesson the fourth floor taught me. That's the story I carry with me every single shift. Stories like this one happen more often than anyone wants to admit. Not the serial killer part, but the other stuff. The small failures, the cultures of silence, the systems that reward looking away. If you're still here, 40 minutes into a story about murder and medicine and the people we trust with our lives, then you understand why these stories matter. You understand why I tell them. Tomorrow, I've got one about a surgical resident who discovered her attending was operating drunk. What she did about it cost her everything, but saved more lives than she'll ever know. Subscribe if you don't want to miss that one. And if you've ever worked in a hospital, if you've ever noticed something that didn't feel right, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Because these stories don't exist to scare you. They exist to remind you that speaking up matters, that noticing matters, that you might be the only thing standing between a patient and a tragedy. Trust your instincts. Always.